So, hello and welcome to the MCC Brussels podcast. I'm Jacob Reynolds, the head of policy here at MCC Brussels, and today delighted to be joined by two special guests. First, we've got Mark Birkbeck, who's with Our Fight. Mark, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me, Jacob.
And delighted to have you on. And we're also joined by Tamir Wurzberger, who's the Foreign Affairs Director of the Action and Protection League, a European NGO combating anti-Semitism. Now, we're releasing this, we hope, on October 7th, and it might be clear from my two guests that we're recording this almost a year after the awful pogrom of October 7th, which not only kind of shook up foreign affairs and world affairs, but brought home for us a really important series of questions that we at MCC Brussels are kind of really interested in and think are extremely important that we probably get to grips with here in Europe. I want to play with you. Our director, Frank Furedi, has been very vocal in noting that the events of October 7th are hugely important for all of us in Europe and right across the world. So I want to play for you just a short clip that Frank's recorded. He can't be with us on the podcast, but I'll play that for you now.
It's been a year since October the 7th, but I still feel October as something that is very real in the here and now. The terrible conflict that was unleashed when Hamas attacked civilians in southern Israel and launched a pogrom against Jewish people is something that is so barbaric that it's impossible to forget. Its consequences are so consequential that it is not surprising that the conflict that was unleashed has become more and more and more intense and is having global consequences. You know, when I look back and see what happened on October the 7th, and look at the faces of those Hamas terrorists laughing and smiling as they went about the business of killing people, murdering people, raping people, I feel a visceral sense of hatred, not just for them, but for the people that have accepted their deeds and called it liberation. In fact, I'm far more disturbed, not by the actions of Hamas, but by the horrible reaction to their action in Western societies, particularly by the intellectuals, particularly by the cultural elites in Europe and America. I'm disgusted by the fact that so many of them pretended that it didn't happen, that so many of them said that it's okay for Hamas to do this because they were decolonizing Palestine. I'm disgusted by the fact that artists, intellectuals, academics, the kind of people that usually know the pain of oppressed people, who usually understand how bad that kind of pogrom-like racist behavior is, that they behaved in such a callous kind of a way, is something that I find difficult to comprehend even now. I'm really disgusted when human rights organizations and NGOs who continually go on about human rights suddenly came to the conclusion that human rights was not to be something that you could have for the Jews that lived in Israel, that somehow feminists who usually go on about male violence became indifferent to the rape of Israeli women on that day. So the reaction to it for me was far, far more painful than my empathy for the victims of October the 7th, because that told me that the world has changed. And the world has changed because suddenly a new fault line has opened up. And the fault line is really between people who still believe in the values of Western civilization and those people that include everybody from Hamas to the Islamists to the NGOs and the LGBTQ identity groups that have lined up together against Western civilization. That fault and that difference between the two sides is consequential. It's got civilizational consequences. So for me, October 7th is very much a call to action. It's a call to action to defend the right of Israel to exist. It's a call to action to defend Jewish people from the barbaric anti-Semitism that's directed to them. And it's a call to action for us to take our civilization, that of the West, seriously. If you're a sovereigntist, if you believe in the nation state and patriotism and the values of the West, from the Greeks to the Renaissance to the Enlightenment onwards, now's the time to take a stand and ensure that something like October the 7th never happens again.
As we can tell from Frank's thoughts there, which very much put a fine point on the fact that in the wake of the awful pogrom, we've learned a lot of things about civil society, our politicians, and wider society in Europe and beyond. Now, my two guests have got some direct experience, especially in this question and looking at kind of what we learned in the first instance about anti-Semitism and about the place of Jews in wider society since that pogrom. So I wanted to come to you both and just get a few reflections. Mark, if I can start with you, you've obviously been at the forefront of this fight, especially in the UK, but what did October 7th and the kind of weeks and months after that really bring home for you about the problem of anti-Semitism?
Yeah, so, many different things as the weeks and the months went by. I think the first initial shock was the October the 9th. On October the 8th, I heard that there was a vigil going to take place opposite Downing Street. So I arranged to attend, and I naively expected there to be lots of people showing solidarity. I expected maybe the odd trade union banner, because as you rightly described it, it was a pogrom. And you thought that no matter what people thought, there would be some kind of show of solidarity. And that was the first shock, that turning up on October the 9th, there were lots of young people, Jewish people, Israeli people, hugging each other, lighting candles. A guitar was produced and people were singing. There were fine words from David Lammy, actually, ironically. We can talk about that later. But they were very much alone. And I bumped into friends who said, "What are you doing here?" "I'm not Jewish, they're Jewish." They said, "What are you doing here?" They were not expecting people to be there. So that was quite a shock. But then that evening when I got home, I then discovered that there'd been a party outside the Israeli embassy. People setting off firecrackers, people cheering and shouting. So that further added to this sense of like, where was the empathy? And not only where was the empathy, but then this kind of celebratory mood that barely 2 days after the pogrom, people were dancing in the streets. So an eye-opener indeed.
Yeah, and Tamir, what was your kind of first initial thoughts or reflections on what this means in kind of wider society when, in the, as I say, the days and weeks after October 7th last June?
Well, I'm originally from Israel. I was born and raised in Israel, and my family is still in Israel. I'm also a third generation to Holocaust survivors. So obviously the atrocities of October 7th had a very direct and strong impact on me as in the personal level, especially the views that we saw. But as someone who was working on combating anti-Semitism for years, I look outside to see the reaction of the general society for what happened. And I said it a long time ago, and I think that it's important to understand the situation. We used to divide anti-Semitism to three main types. So we have the classic anti-Semitism, which based on more religion elements. We have the modern anti-Semitism, which is the race came up and became the dominant factor. And at the last few decades, we're dealing with what we call new anti-Semitism, which is based on anti-Israel and anti-Zionism sentiments. After October 7, I think that we can, I'll say it another way, I think that October 7 marked or signed the end of new anti-Semitism era and the beginning of the new Nazism era. Because, every time when we had some terror attack in Israel, there were always some excuses or explanations why it's okay. And it always came from the political aspect. So why it's okay to kill Jews, why it's okay to all the suicide bombers and all the now shooting attacks, it's because something that Israel did, because of the settlers, because of the settlements, because of the occupation. there are always some political arguments. October 7 is something that you cannot justify with political arguments. And here came up the pure classic Nazism of people who are not just hate Jews, but they are accepting and even justifying killing of Jews, but massive killing of Jews with no reason. There is no reason for burning babies in their beds. There is no reason to do massive rape of women. There is no justifying for killing elderly people, to kidnap people. There is no justifying for what we saw in October 7. And when people could not justify it in a political argument, so the mask removed, and we saw that the old pure Nazism of people just happy for Jews who getting killed.
Yeah, and I mean, this question of what was kind of really revealed in the West, I think was really brought home in those weeks afterwards, where the standard narrative about Israel is that Israel is this country that is kind of only exists because it's fully supported by Western powers, by American power, by aid and military aid by other countries. And yet we saw immediately, didn't we, this kind of real discomfort, this inability for Western politicians to stand up and in uncertain terms kind of say what was actually happening and why it was that Israel had a right, even an obligation, to kind of stand up and defend itself. Mark, what were some of the kind of key figures or key kind of interventions in the public debate that really kind of made you come to realize that this was something that you in particular had to kind of lead a bit and start with the setup of the organization, which maybe you can talk about a bit?
Yeah, so you're quite right. Although the organization initially was around the empathy question that I mentioned. So it was really that we were struck, and a number of my friends were also struck, had the same feeling when we went to vigils, when we went to support the Jewish community, that there was nobody else there. So that was kind of the initial impetus to have a solidarity campaign that would turn up. But then as the weeks, as you rightly say, as the weeks progressed, you started to get Palestine Solidarity Campaign marches through central London. And then particularly David Cameron, you asked for figures, David Cameron and the Foreign Office started to kind of hint that they were not happy. They started to put pressure on. There were demands for an immediate ceasefire, which was the slogan that you kept hearing, which obviously means surrender. And the Foreign Office, I think, the British Foreign Office has played a particular role here in putting pressure on the politicians. Obviously, Cameron is then superseded by Lamy, who then goes the whole hog and starts to issue arms embargoes against Israel, which has an incredible power to it, to the message. Fairly early on as well, you had the ICJ court case, the accusation of genocide, which is a really strong part of this whole story, this idea that you can be arguing with somebody who's never read a book in their life and they'll say, but there's a genocide going on. And Jeremy Corbyn and Ben Jamal and the Stop the War Coalition, they'll march through the streets of London with big banners that say stop the genocide. It just trips off the tongue for people. So that also is a very, very important aspect to this whole story. And unfortunately, Lamy and the Foreign Office, by playing the game that they did with the arms embargoes, they feed into that, even though they claim they won't. They feed into this kind of anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist narrative, because they're sort of dropping hints. It's like they're dropping a hint, we're only withdrawing, £10 million worth of arms. But of course, the very fact that they're saying there's a question mark over how Israel might use those arms feeds into that accusatory narrative.
Yeah, and Tamir, obviously Mark's got direct experience with the example in the UK, which maybe were some of the kind of most overt displays outside America, and maybe we can get onto America. But what were you kind of picking up and noticing, especially in Europe? I know in Brussels, while I've been in Brussels, there were some big so-called Palestine solidarity marches, which didn't really look much like solidarity to me. But what was your sense of the kind of broader European landscape in terms of the reaction?
No, I'm working a lot with MEPs in Brussels, members of the European Parliament, and decision makers. You know, how we saw a lot of sympathy at the beginning. I have to say that the European Union, the European Parliament, is a very complex stage. So you have from one side the very pro-Israeli groups, especially more from the right side of the political spectrum. If we have to mention the groups according the new order in the European Parliament, so of course the Patriots for Europe are probably the most pro-Israeli MEPs. We're working a lot with these MEPs and with these groups. We have the ECR as well, that they are very in Israel's favor, and most of the EPP, I think. But the moment that you go from the EPP to the left, and I'm talking about the liberals, which is the Renew Europe, and then the social democratic group, and then of course when you're getting to the green and to the left, so it's getting more radical. So over there you see more controversial positions. I remember that we were involved with some of the resolutions of the European Parliament regarding the war in Gaza, and you saw the amendments that came from the left and from the Green and from the Social Democratic Party, the Social Democratic Group. You saw the amendments, and you know they tried to turn all the situation and to create some distorted picture that like Israel is the bad guy here, and to turn such resolutions against Israel. When they're totally ignored what happened in October 7, no word about the atrocities of October 7, no word about the hostages. So it's a very complex situation. I always, I don't like to compare because, that every case is different. But you can see the hypocrisy of the European Union as a political body when you compare between the policy of the European Union regarding Israel and the policy of the European Union regarding the war in Ukraine. For example, you didn't see that the war in Ukraine is going on for more than 2 years. No one ever talked about ceasefire in the European Union regarding the war in Ukraine. No one is even try to speak up for ceasefire in Ukraine. And you're talking about two sovereign countries who are fighting. I'm not coming to take any position here, but that's the fact. You have two sovereign countries with two armies that fighting each other, which one of them is a nuclear powerful country. This is one case. On the other hand, you have Israel, which is democratic country, fighting against terror organizations. And it's not me saying that this is a terror organization. Hamas is a terror organization, or Hezbollah. They listed in the EU terror list as terror organization, terrorist organizations. Same with the U.S. State Department. They listed there as well, terror list. So, at the beginning of October 7, I attended some webinar with of the young Republicans in the States, and we had Congressman Mike Lawler. He was there as well, he spoke there as well, and he said, in a very American way, very straight and direct way, he said, if after September 11, someone will tell America to stop the war in Afghanistan, he used the F word, but he said, this is what we will tell this person. And, it seems that regarding Israel, there is double standards, and people feel more comfortable to express or to use Israel to strengthen their self ego or the self-importance, like to feel more moral Israel's back.
Yeah. And I want to get into those double standards in a bit, but one of the things that you touched on a little earlier there, Tamir, was the way in which the politics surrounding Israel and anti-Semitism have kind of developed and changed. Now, we've known, I mean, it's been a standard feature of kind of traditional left-wing politics that Israel is kind of the bad guy, and that there have been various solidarity campaigns for Palestine over the years. But one thing that I think was new, and I'm really interested in both your thoughts on this, one thing that seemed new about this was the way in which some of the contemporary language we hear around identity politics, what is kind of commonly called woke, the way in which that has given a different and a new impetus to anti-Semitism. So that you have this weird kind of coalition, it seems, in many Western countries between people who are not even left-wing in any traditional sense. The thing that motivates them is not kind of better wages for workers or anything like that, but it's instead identity issues such as trans issues or gay rights issues and all the rest of it. And suddenly you had this coming together between that group and the pro-Palestine, or in many cases the pro-Hamas kind of campaign. Mark, if I start with you on this, what did that kind of new constellation reveal for you about the way in which anti-Semitism and the kind of struggles that Israel faces are kind of changed?
So I would look at it as actually the other way around to the way that people often explain this. So you're talking here about identity politics giving impetus to anti-Semitism, and I think that's part of the story. But I think what's really striking is that anti-Semitism gives impetus to identity politics. Anti-Semitism is the major issue, I would say the most important issue that humanity faces, in fact, because it has this ability to accelerate other ideas. So you can see here that it's anti-Semitism that's able to bring together radical Islamism, the woke identity politics that you're describing, rather than the other way around. And you'll see, if you go on a Palestine Solidarity March, you'll see it's quite, there'll be people shouting how they love 7th of October. There'll be people who are even in the early days with Hamas flags, Hezbollah flags, marching alongside left-wingers, and people not batting an eyelid. So this alliance. So you're right, there's a lot of complicated factors that identity politics brings with it. But I think anti-Semitism is the unifying factor. And I think as well, you touched on it's under the guise, or using the language, of anti-Zionism. So, and that's something that we've been seeing for a while. So although, again, it was massively accelerated after October the 7th, I think a lot of these fault lines you could already see with the Jeremy Corbyn affair around the Labour Party in the UK, and the fact that people were prepared to turn a blind eye. And ironically now, you're seeing people actually say, well, look, this shows that Jeremy was right all along. Because now what they're really saying is, now we're all anti-Semitic. What was so special about Jeremy Corbyn, So it's kind of an ironic twist, which makes our job even more urgent, I would say. But there's a journal called Fathom Journal, and a writer, Alan Johnson, who makes this great point. I would urge people to check these out if they're not already familiar with it. And he basically says you can be as anti-Semitic as you want nowadays, as long as you're anti-Zionist. And that it's true. They're indistinguishable. It's the new cover. It's the new language.
Yeah, Tammy, your thoughts on this point?
There was an American philosopher, George Santayana, and he said, "Those who forgot the past condemned to repeat it." And I had a meeting a few months ago with Deborah Lifstadt, Ambassador Deborah Lifstadt. Is the U.S. Special Envoy for combating anti-Semitism. She was in Budapest for a visit, and we met her with small Jewish organizations. And I mentioned this sentence, and I said that, I live in Europe for 7 years, and as I mentioned, I'm third generation to Holocaust survivors. And I saw what's happening around me. Not necessarily in Hungary, in Budapest, which is a very safe place for Jews, but in Western Europe, you see in Germany that Jewish houses and businesses marked by David stars Molotov cocktails were thrown on Jewish synagogues in Paris, in Germany. Terror attacks just this week, by the way. Grenades on the Israeli embassy in Sweden, shooting in the Israeli embassy in Copenhagen, in Denmark. People chanting in the streets, gas for Jews. I know, as third generation to Holocaust survivor, I saw what's happening. I say, it feels like we got 90 years back. The history repeats itself. So maybe we are not in Auschwitz yet. We're not in the gas chambers, but we definitely, and this is what I said to Ambassador Boran-Lüstadt, I thought, well, maybe we're not in Auschwitz yet, but we are definitely in Kishinev right now. The pogroms in Kishinev. This is how it feels. And for making Auschwitz happen again, you need the right public atmosphere that allows it, and one crazy man that will take it to the practical level. Now, regarding what you asked about the political identities, this is what we call the green-red coalition. And I mentioned this sentence by George Santayana because you have in one side a large population in Europe, Arab Muslim population, that the European story, the story of the Holocaust, the story of what happened with the Jews in Europe 90 years ago, this is not their story. This is not their story in one side. On the other hand, you have the progressives that they are trying to rewrite the history. They are trying to challenge the core identity of the people. So when people who deny the core identity of us, their own people, their own nations in one side, and people who are not belonging to these collectives, this coalition creates a situation of people who forgot the past and tend to repeat it. And this is what we see today.
Yeah, and one of the things, I mean, it's impossible to discuss anti-Semitism, as you both noted, the way that anti-Zionism has become the kind of acceptable face of anti-Semitism means that in any discussion of anti-Semitism, we also have to discuss Israel. And it strikes me that one of the things that kind of Israel has very much come to represent, which lots of people, maybe even not anti-Semites, but for lots of people are deeply uncomfortable with Israel, in part because Israel is so forthrightly kind of taking up the mantle of something which is very entitled to, which is defending its people and defending its sovereignty. And Mark, what do you think is kind of, how has anti-Zionism become this acceptable face of anti-Semitism?
Yes, so, well, in terms of just gritty language, it's you'll see placards where people effectively say Zio-fascist and things like that. So you're able to accuse Jews and Israelis of all sorts of things. You know, what in the past we'd have called a blood libel. You know, they want to murder children. They go out of their way to murder civilians. You can say any of those things that you like. You can hold Israel to a different standard, and you can say any of those things you like as long as you make sure the word Zionism appears somewhere in the sentence. So I think in that way, it's difficult to distinguish it from anti-Semitism. I don't think there is any point in distinguishing it. What people try to do is they try to say, well, what I am doing is I'm criticizing Israel. And so they might say, oh, we need more lorries of aid and all the rest of it. But that isn't true, because the language that's being used is completely over the top. If any discussion you have, pretty much any discussion you have, people will accuse Israel of lying. You know, there isn't any level at which Israel seems to be accepted as a normal nation. So the whole thing is just. So I think we have to somehow. I mean, the approach I've taken now is I say I'm a Zionist. I don't see any point in not. I don't see any point in imagining that there's a nuanced debate. Some people still do think that, you know, I don't know, we're in the sort of 19th century and we're having a sort of interesting intellectual debate about what Zionism is and means, but I don't see any point. Anti-Zionism represents anti-Semitism, so therefore, if you want to challenge anti-Semitism, I think you might as well say you're a Zionist, because essentially, sorry to go on, but essentially all it's saying is that Jews have a right to a homeland, and and I think that's the thing. If we need to just keep saying that, because what people try to do is say, no, Zionism means something else. It's the Elon Pape version, it's the Nakba, it's the sort of ethnic cleansing. They're trying to say that there's some core thing to Zionism, which makes it sort of, warlike.
Toxic.
Toxic. Exactly. So I think, say, well, you support Portugal's right to a nation. Why? Nobody's invading Iran even. Who knows? So that's probably a bad example. But yeah, anyway, so making a clear point, Zionism represents the right for people to have a nation.
Yeah, and Tammy, we touched earlier on this question of double standards, and that seems to, it certainly applies to the Jews living in Western Europe or Israeli Jews living in Western Europe, but it applies really strongly to Israel as well, doesn't it? I was really forced to recognize this when, after Israel blew up all of those Hezbollah pages, and I was thinking in the past that somebody might have joked in the past that even if the Israelis had invented a weapon that only targets somehow magically terrorists in a kind of 1 meter area, people would have said that's still unacceptable, right? The collateral damage is still so high. And then they actually did, in effect, create a weapon that only targets terrorists, and still there was this kind of sense that this was an unacceptable act to take. And so isn't that question of double standards really pertinent when it comes to Israel?
Of course, because people like Jews only when they are the victims. People don't like the Jews when they are strong and has the ability to defend themselves. And Israel is the only country, I think, that its right to self-defense is under question. And it's all cause of anti-Semitism because, regarding your previous question to Mark about Zionism, as I said at the beginning, anti-Semitism, I've been in Auschwitz a few years ago in a delegation. We had our Rabbi Meir Israel Lau, who was the previous chief rabbi of Israel, Holocaust survivor by himself. And he said that anti-Semitism is a virus. And after COVID, we all became experts for viruses. So we all know that virus has some variations, some variants, and they always under evolution. So the moment that you created some, you developed your immune system, the virus will find another platform to attack your body. And this is what we see regarding anti-Semitism. As I said, it started in some way in a religion-based hatred, and then it developed to race, and then it developed to nationality or national anti-Semitism. This is the core of the problem, because when you're talking about the double standards, when you're talking about why people are hating Zionism, is exactly because of that. Because as Mark mentioned, Zionism, after all, is the national movement of the Jews for the establishment. It's a political movement for establishment to fulfill the right for self-determination of the Jewish people. Jews are the only ethnical group who doesn't has the right for self-determination. This double standard is pure anti-Semitism. This is exactly the anti-Semitism that we are talking about when we're talking about the new anti-Semitism that targeting Israel and Zionism. These people, what they say, no, we don't hate Jews, we hate only Israel and Zionism. And then the other hand, they say all the Jews are Zionists. This is why they are a legitimate target. This is why they go to shoot on Jewish schools in Toulouse, France, and the Jewish museum in Brussels. This is why they mark Jewish houses with David stars in Berlin. And this is why they're chanting gas for Jews in all over Europe and all over the world. So
Yeah. In many ways, a lot has been, as we discussed, an awful lot has been brought home over the past year. And one of the concerns that I know is shared amongst many of us at MCC Brussels is the concern that this problem is far from kind of getting better, from people being woken up to the fact of what's going on, but actually this problem is getting worse. And so we got a big job to confront it. I mean, to end, I'd just like to ask, both of you are in different ways at the forefront of challenging anti-Semitism. What part of the battle are you going to be particularly focused on over the coming period, or what argument or kind of point do you think we really need to put a fine mark on to make sure that we can start to kind of turn the tide of anti-Semitism? Mark.
Yeah, so what I'm about to say is quite a hard argument, but I do feel that unfortunately it's probably the only way. I'm sure you're familiar, Jacob, with Arendt and her book on totalitarianism, but her description of anti-Semitism, one of the ways she looks at it is that Jews end up being a proxy for other struggles. So if you're anti-monarchy or anti-nation, you end up, the Jews end up being kind of caught in the crosshair, and the attacks on those institutions, people end up attacking Jews, and anti-Semitism takes different forms. And I think to link this back to Frank's video that you showed at the beginning, what we're seeing now is the sort of anti-civilizational, decolonizing language and struggle that's sort of like ripping across the world like a wildfire, is actually catching Israel and the Jews in its headlights, in its crossfire. And so anti-Semitism is going hand in hand with these. So essentially, if you want to be anti-civilization, and by that it's anti-nation, anti-America, anti-progress, then you become anti-Zionist. And so it means that it's a very hard struggle because anti-Semitism has now got this kind of energy that is drawing this out. But on a positive note, it also means it's more, we have many allies, because what we should now be doing is, you've seen the sort of videos that people like Julia Hartley-Brewer and people are doing where they're saying, look, this is a civilizational struggle. And more people are coming to that conclusion. So I think if you want to challenge anti-Semitism, you need to link it very, very starkly, very clearly to this anti-civilizational struggle, and say it's not just an existential threat for Israel, it's an existential threat for us as well. Because if we allow these ideas to take hold about Israel and about the Jews, then, as Tamir said, we know where it leads. And the best guarantee we have about protecting from that in the future is to stop it now and to reassert the values that we all share.
People say that you cannot defeat idea. We heard a lot regarding the war in Gaza and Hamas. People say, no, you cannot beat Hamas because Hamas is an idea. You cannot defeat idea. That's not true, because the Nazi regime got defeated. Nazism got defeated in the Second World War. It doesn't mean that you don't have people with Nazi agenda, but they don't have the society acceptance to express their ideas, and anti-Semitism will not disappear. Anti-Semitism will stay. It was here for thousands of years, and it will stay here. Unfortunately, we must be honest and to recognize that this is the situation. The main goal is to create anti-Semitism illegitimate, as Nazism is today. In order to make it illegitimate, we need to work, first of all, to keep doing this kind of conversations and webinars, and to keep talk about it, wherever we can and with whoever we can. because I will say that we are out of number. When we're looking at the other side, the Arab Muslim population, wherever you will go in, no matter what Western country, we're out of number. So it will be maybe a suicide mission to try to compete with demonstrations, pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and so forth. What we are trying to do in our organization is, first of all, to go to the top of the pyramid as much as possible, and to talk and to try to influence the decision makers, because after all, the public has a very strong power, but the decision makers are those who should shape the policy. So this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to do it with details. It means we started to work at the last few months, or maybe the last few years. The last year, we started to work with a new system that allows us to monitor anti-Semitic expressions even in the social media. And this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to bring the reality, to bring the field to the decision makers, to show decision makers what is happening and how deep and problematic is the phenomenon. And to try to push for a policy. This is what we are trying to do since October 7th, is to try to push for an effective action of the European Union against anti-Semitism. This is what we are trying to do, and I think that these kind of platforms are amazing platforms to promote it. And thank you so much for you, Jacob, and for the MCC process for giving us the opportunity to talk about it.
Yeah, certainly, I think right from the top, and with conversations with leaders, we definitely need leaders who are prepared to lead on this issue. But also, certainly Mark's point is very well taken, that this is a broad social struggle that requires us to win arguments with a huge range of people and really kind of develop the ability to speak about this and to win people over and to demonstrate in no uncertain terms what's going on. This conversation's only been a very small part of that, but thank you very much, Mark and Tamir, for lending your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.